August 26th, 1346, northern France. 9,000 tired English soldiers waited in the mud, facing 30,000 of Europe's richest and most powerful knights. The French were sure of victory. They had armor, horses, and noble blood. The English had peasants, bows, and discipline. 4 hours later, 1,500 French nobles were dead. Princes, dukes, even kings. The English lost only 40 men, not 400. 40. A weapon worth 10 shillings, destroyed armor worth £1,000. 500 years of noble warfare ended in one afternoon, killed by commoners obeying a law that forced them to practice archery every Sunday. That was the day courage met calculation, and lost. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. At dawn, the air over the village of Crécy was thick with rain and arrogance. Edward III of England had only 9,000 men left, exhausted, soaked, retreating north toward Calais. Behind him stretched a trail of burned farms and empty villages, the result of months of raids through Normandy. Ahead of him, an army 3 times his size, the pride of France, led by King Philip VI, thundered closer with the confidence of divine certainty. Edward's men were cold and silent. The French sang battle hymns. It was not merely an army marching toward them, but 5 centuries of a worldview. That war was proof of nobility and courage, the measure of God's favor. Nearly every great lord in France was there. Princes from the Holy Roman Empire, dukes from Lorraine, counts from Flanders, banners embroidered with saints and lions. They came not just to fight, but to be seen. Some argued over who would have the honor of capturing the English king alive. Others laughed that Edward's army looked more like a mob of criminals than soldiers, a mix of peasants, poachers, and Welsh archers hardened by poverty and punishment. But Edward had built something no chivalric order understood, a system. For decades, English law had required every able man to train with the longbow each Sunday. Failure to do so was punishable. Archery wasn't a hobby, it was policy, a national habit enforced by bureaucracy. These men didn't dream of glory, they followed instructions. They had learned to obey the rhythm of war the same way they obeyed the rhythm of tax. Their strength wasn't pride, it was procedure. Edward surveyed the muddy ridge near Crécy and saw what the French could not: terrain that favored patience over prestige. He divided his men into 3 lines, forming a shallow V on the hillside. At the edges, archers drove sharpened stakes into the ground to stop charging horses. Trenches were dug. Arrows were planted point up in the soil for quick reloads. Then he did something no king had ever dared. He ordered his own knights to dismount, to fight beside the peasants. It was unthinkable. For 500 years, a mounted charge had been the heartbeat of European warfare. Armor was honor. The horse was identity. To fight on foot was to descend into the mud, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people one ruled. But Edward understood a truth the French refused to see. Honor does not stop arrows. Across the valley, Philip's nobles saw the English formations and sneered. They called it cowardice, a defensive posture unworthy of kings. They did not see the geometry. They saw only insult. The rain began to fall again, heavy and cold. English archers unstrung their bows, tucking cords under helmets to keep them dry. The French laughed. Their armor would protect them, they thought. But steel could not protect against mathematics. Every arrow loosed that day carried the weight of law, labor, and time, the quiet violence of routine. And when the first volley flew, it was not the sound of chaos. It was the sound of order, the rhythm of an empire that had learned how to turn obedience into death. England's victory at Crécy did not begin on the battlefield. It began half a century earlier, with a line of text buried in royal law. In 1285, King Edward I passed the Statute of Winchester, an administrative decree that quietly rewired the kingdom. It required every man to keep arms according to his wealth and to train with them regularly. A noble was expected to maintain armor and horse, a farmer a bow. The difference was choice. The noble could fight for honor. The peasant was ordered to fight by statute. By the early 1300s, the law had become a rhythm that governed daily life. Every Sunday, after church, across the towns and parishes of England, the same ritual played out. The priest ended Mass, dismissed the congregation, and the bells signaled another form of worship. In fields beside the chapels, men lined up with bows of yew, strings taut, fingers cracked. They drew and loosed again and again until arms ached and lungs burned. To miss practice was to break the law. Failure meant fines. Habit was not optional. Even boys were required to own bows, scaled to their size. What began as a clause of order evolved into the most efficient weapons program in medieval Europe. The longbow was cheap, a simple stave of wood worth about 10 shillings, but deadly when paired with discipline. In trained hands, an archer could fire 12 arrows a minute, striking targets 200 yards away. That rhythm, multiplied by 5,000 archers, produced 60,000 arrows every minute, each one capable of punching through armor worth 1,000 pounds. The math of war was changing. England had discovered a terrifying truth. Bureaucracy could kill more reliably than faith. By Edward III's reign, the system was mature. The sheriffs enforced it, priests oversaw it, and the population obeyed it. Parish records tracked who trained and who paid their fines. The countryside had become a military factory disguised as farmland. Across the Channel, France still believed courage was a birthright. The sons of dukes and counts were trained to ride, not to repeat. Their skills were inherited, not enforced. Valor was performance, discipline, a privilege. In England, it was inverted. War was no longer theatre, it was paperwork. Every Sunday, men rehearsed the same motion: draw, anchor, loose, breathe. The repetition carved itself into the body. Centuries later, archaeologists would find the evidence written in bone: left arms longer, shoulders twisted, spines bent from the strain of decades. Their skeletons were public records, the state's handwriting engraved in calcium. These were not men of inspiration, they were men of repetition. They did not pray for victory, they practiced it. When Edward III landed in Normandy in July 1346 with 15,000 men, half of them archers, he didn't summon knights to fight for glory. He mobilized citizens who had been training since childhood, not by passion, but by penalty. The French mocked them as criminals and peasants, but they were looking at something far more dangerous, a machine built from monotony. England had turned obedience into muscle memory. The crown didn't need to buy loyalty. It only needed to maintain the law. The longbow was the perfect weapon for this system. Cheap to make, slow to master, but unstoppable once embedded into a culture. A knight's armor cost the fortune of a village. A bow cost the wage of a week. Yet the bow won because it belonged to everyone. It was the first weapon of mass discipline. In England, the act of drawing a bow was no longer a sign of rebellion. It was civic duty. The same law that fined a man for skipping practice could one day make him lethal in battle. The same rhythm that structured his Sunday leisure would, in war, decide who lived and who drowned in mud. Across England's shires, this system had worked in silence for decades. Local reeves inspected targets. Sheriffs were fined if they failed to enforce practice. Even clergy were commanded to oversee archery sessions. The order ran so deep it turned religion itself into rehearsal. Piety and precision became indistinguishable. To pull the bowstring was to obey both crown and creed. By the time the English army reached Crécy in late August, they did not look powerful. They looked patient. Their strength was invisible, stored not in horses or armor, but in habit. When they set their stakes and checked their bowstrings that night, they weren't improvising defenses. They were repeating a drill older than themselves. Every man there had done this hundreds of times, in rain, in mud, under inspection. The French would arrive the next day believing they were facing an army of peasants. They weren't. They were facing the cumulative weight of 50 years of bureaucracy, a kingdom that had learned how to weaponize time itself. England didn't just arm its poor, it standardized them. And when dawn broke over Crécy, and the order finally came to raise bows, 5,000 men obeyed without hesitation, because they weren't responding to courage or faith or even fear. They were responding to something far colder, the memory of law. The French brought armor, lineage, and pride. The English brought procedure. And that difference, enforced by decades of quiet legislation, would decide the fate of Europe's nobility before noon. By August 25th, 1346, the roads of northern France trembled under the weight of an army too proud to wait. King Philip VI of France had gathered the greatest host in Christendom, 30 to 35,000 men, 12,000 of them armored cavalry. It was more than a mobilization, it was a pageant. Every noble family in France was represented. Banners of lions, lilies, and crosses shimmered in the late summer light. Behind them rode the Dukes of Alençon, Lorraine, and Burgundy, the Counts of Flanders and Bar, and contingents from the Holy Roman Empire. Even John of Bohemia, blind for 10 years, came to fight, led by his retainers, determined to die among kings. To them, this was not a campaign. It was a coronation by combat. Each noble came dressed for glory, armor polished to a mirror, horses adorned with silk. They rode not toward battle, but toward immortality. Edward III's ragged army of 9,000 Englishmen, peasants, poachers, and criminals, seemed a humiliation unworthy of France's splendor. Many knights quarreled over who would have the honor of capturing Edward alive. Some even wrote their names on lists, as if reserving a seat at a feast. But behind the pomp was chaos. Philip's army had marched for days through the ruins left by Edward's chevauchés, a trail of scorched earth stretching from Normandy to the Somme. Villages still burned, livestock scattered, the stench of smoke clinging to armor. The men were exhausted, hungry, and angry. Their own country looked like it had already lost. Philip's advisors urged caution. The English were entrenched on high ground near the village of Crécy en Ponthieu. Their archers fortified, their supplies intact. The sensible move was to rest and strike at dawn. But patience was not a French virtue. Nobles did not wait for orders. They expected them to confirm what pride already decided. Late that afternoon, thunderclouds rolled over the horizon. Rain poured across the valley, turning the soil into slick mud. The English, disciplined and prepared, unstrung their bows and sheltered their cords under helmets and cloaks to keep them dry. Across the field, the Genoese mercenaries, hired crossbowmen numbering 5,000, did not. Their strings slackened in the rain, their bows losing power. No one noticed. The nobles were too busy shouting, too drunk on confidence. Philip VI finally reached the rear lines around 4 p.m., drenched, exhausted, and desperate to regain control. He ordered the army to halt for the night, but the front ranks were already advancing. Trumpets sounded prematurely. Some thought it was a signal to attack. Others simply refused to be second in the charge. The command chain collapsed instantly. The French host stopped being an army and became a mob. Thousands of men in steel, spurred by vanity and noise. No formation, no discipline, just lineage in motion. Counts and dukes surged forward, waving banners, shouting their family names, eager to be seen. The rain mixed with sweat and panic. Mud swallowed hooves. Servants slipped beneath trampling horses. Still, they pressed on. Behind the advancing knights, the Genoese mercenaries were ordered to open fire and soften the English lines. They trudged forward, bows weakened, shields left behind with the baggage train miles away. At 150 yards, they loosed their first volley. Most of the bolts fell short, clattering harmlessly in the mud. Then came the English reply. 5,000 longbows sang at once. Witnesses said it sounded like thunder. The sky darkened under 60,000 arrows a minute. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and half a minute's delay between shots. They were erased in seconds. Panic rippled through their lines. They turned to flee, straight into the path of French cavalry charging behind them. Count d'Alençon, furious at the retreat, shouted the order that sealed their fate. "Cut down this rabble blocking our way!" French knights lowered their lances and rode through their own mercenaries, slaughtering them in waves. Thousands died, not by English arrows, but by the blades of the men who had hired them. When Philip's advisors tried to stop the charge, it was already too late. The storm of arrows kept falling. Horses screamed as shafts tore through eyes, necks, and legs. The French vanguard stumbled over the dying Genoese. Momentum broke. Knights collided with one another, armor grinding like millstones. Each second, another noble vanished into the mud. This was the moment Crécy became a catastrophe. A war of pride fought against geometry. The English didn't move. They didn't shout. They simply released, reloaded, and released again, their arrows falling with mechanical precision. The French, blinded by rain and arrogance, had charged straight into a death trap built by discipline. By nightfall, the valley was chaos. Piles of armoured bodies blocked the advance. Horses reared and fell, crushing their riders. Behind them, the French command dissolved into panic. Some shouted for retreat, others for vengeance. Philip VI's own horse was struck by an arrow and collapsed, nearly pinning him beneath it. The king was dragged from the field by his guards as his nobles continued to charge into the dark. No one would count the dead until morning. But already the legend of chivalry was dying there in the mud. Not from treachery, not from cowardice, but from pride too heavy to turn back. It began with a misunderstanding and ended with a massacre. As the first Genoese bolts fell short, the English lines answered with precision. 5,000 longbows loosed in unison, 12 arrows each per minute. Within seconds, 60,000 shafts rained down across the valley. Witnesses said the air turned black. The arrows fell in sheets, cutting through the storm, hissing like rain made of iron. The Genoese mercenaries had no shields, no trenches, no hope. They tried to reload, but their bowstrings, soaked from the downpour, had stretched uselessly. Their crossbows, once formidable, now fired half their usual range. They were trapped in open ground. The first ranks collapsed, the second hesitated. Then, panic. A sound sharper than any weapon rippled through their lines. They began to run. Behind them, the French cavalry saw retreat and mistook it for treachery. Count d'Alençon, brother of the king, bellowed the words that doomed thousands. "Cut down this rabble. Clear the way." The nobles obeyed instantly. In a blur of steel and mud, French knights spurred forward, lances lowered, trampling their own men. What followed was not battle, it was slaughter. Horses crashed into human bodies. Blades slashed through armor meant for the enemy. The Genoese screamed, trapped between the arrows ahead and hooves behind. In minutes, 5,000 hired professionals were reduced to pulp beneath the pride of France. And still, the English kept firing. Every archer on the ridge shot by instinct. Draw, loose, draw, loose. 12 arrows a minute, each one a signature of discipline. The range was perfect. The mud slowed the French horses. Armor became a coffin. Men who had spent their lives training to kill others were now being crushed by their own. Count d'Alençon's order, born from fury and arrogance, had destroyed the army's eyes. The Genoese had been the only range support France possessed. Now there were none left to counter the English fire. The field between the armies became a swamp of corpses. The stench of sweat, rain, and blood clung to the air. The ground trembled beneath collapsing horses. Philip VI's banner waved uncertainly in the distance. The king, still behind the second line, could see nothing but confusion. Waves of armored men galloping toward disaster. His commanders pleaded for control, but no one was listening. Honor was louder than reason. The first French charge had already failed before reaching the English lines. The surviving Genoese fled, throwing down their crossbows and running for the rear. French nobles shouted curses, calling them cowards. But what was cowardice to a man abandoned by the very army that hired him? Some were cut down as they ran, others were ridden over by knights determined to reach the hill. None would make it out alive. By this point, the battlefield was chaos incarnate. Horses stumbled over corpses. The rain turned the earth into sucking mud. Heavy armor pulled men down as they fell, pinning them beneath fallen beasts. Some drowned. Others screamed for help that never came. Still, the second wave of French cavalry advanced, because to stop was shame. Above them, the English hill remained silent. There was no shouting, no charge, only the rhythmic sound of bowstrings snapping back. The discipline was terrifying. Each archer knew his place, his distance, his timing. They had planted their arrows point up in the ground before the battle, so their hands never stopped moving. It was a machine. 5,000 peasants synchronized by habit. One chronicler later wrote that the sky itself seemed to bleed. Another said the arrows fell so thick that they seemed to blot out the sun. It was not exaggeration. When 60,000 arrows fall every minute for hours, the sound itself becomes a weapon. An endless roar of tension and impact, like a storm tearing through flesh and iron. For the French knights, the world narrowed to one sensation: weight. The weight of armor, the weight of horse, the weight of falling comrades. Their charge had no momentum left, only inertia dragging them into death. The Genoese were gone, but their corpses remained, clogging the field and breaking formation. Still, Count d'Alençon pressed forward, determined to reach the English line. Behind him, more nobles joined, unwilling to be left behind. They rode into the same wall of arrows, repeating the same mistake. Each impact was a lesson ignored, each charge a ritual of pride performed for no one. Philip VI tried to restore order. He sent messengers to halt the attack, but they never reached the front. The chaos swallowed commands as quickly as it swallowed men. Even the sound of horns and drums drowned in the storm of arrows. The king's grand army, 30,000 strong, had dissolved into fragments, each fighting its own invisible war. When darkness began to fall, the French vanguard was gone. In its place lay a field of mangled bodies, Genoese, French, noble, and nameless, indistinguishable in the mud. Armor, once shining with lineage, now looked the same as a beggar's tunic. The English had not moved a single step downhill, and yet the valley was filled with the dead. The French had brought music, banners, and ceremony to Crécy. But the only sound that remained was the hiss of arrows and the rain striking armor, a metronome marking the death of chivalry. The first mistake had been pride. The second, obedience to pride. Both were fatal. By the time the last Genoese fell, the French advance had lost all shape. What had begun as the proudest army in Europe was now a storm of noise and steel collapsing into itself. And above that chaos, calm. 9,000 Englishmen standing on high ground, silent except for the rhythm of bowstrings. Each English archer could loose 12 arrows a minute. Each shaft, a yard long, tipped with bodkin iron, built not to slash, but to puncture. 5,000 men firing together meant 60,000 arrows every minute, or 1,000,000 in less than 20. It wasn't bravery that filled the sky, it was arithmetic. The French knights charged again, forcing their horses through the slick mud, trampling the dead Genoese. The weight of armor turned each movement into labor. The mud sucked at hooves like a trap. Arrows struck the horses first, in the neck, in the eye between armor plates, because the English had learned the hierarchy of death. Kill the animal, then the man. A single wounded horse could topple 3 riders behind it. A single fallen knight could block an entire column. It was efficiency, not valor. From a distance, the valley seemed alive. The glint of armor flickered like light on water. But up close, it was only bodies. Horses flailing, men screaming, weapons slipping from blood-soaked hands. The French had brought 5 centuries of military tradition into the mud, and in minutes, it was obsolete. Edward III's formation never broke. The hill was his fortress, and his geometry was perfect. The army formed a shallow V-shape, with archers on the flanks. Their fields of fire overlapped, creating cross angles of death. The first line of men-at-arms stood ready with axes and maces, but they hardly moved. There was no need. The longbow did the work. Each English archer had prepared his ground before the battle, sharpening stakes, planting them at an angle to impale charging horses. In front of them, the earth was riddled with hidden pits, filled with water and mud. They had transformed the slope into a machine for killing nobles. Every step uphill was another grave. The rain had stopped, but the mist remained. The air smelled of wet iron and smoke. The English archers had waxed their strings with beeswax before dawn. Their bows stayed dry and taut. Across the field, the French still struggled with soaked weapons, dulled blades, and shattered morale. No one commanded the charge anymore. It was pride driving itself downhill. Witnesses described the sound of the longbows as thunder, and the sight as impossible. A continuous wave of arrows falling so thick that the sky seemed to turn dark. When one quiver ran out, archers pulled shafts from the ground or from corpses. They didn't stop to aim. They didn't need to. The range was perfect, the repetition absolute. Each man moved as if connected to the next, the kind of precision that only bureaucracy can teach. Knights tried to shield themselves, but the arrows didn't care. They struck horses through the nostrils, men through visors, into armpits, between the joints of plate and mail. A lucky shot could split a skull through a slit no wider than a coin. Even when they didn't pierce, they crushed. A bodkin tip hitting at 150 miles per hour could dent plate, crack ribs, break breath. The French cavalry disintegrated on contact. The first wave fell, the second stumbled over them. By the third, there was no formation, only inertia. Knights collided with one another, slipped in blood, and sank beneath their own horses. The mud turned red, then black. Armor, once a symbol of divine favor, became a prison. Men drowned standing up, suffocating under 60 pounds of steel. Edward III watched from the ridge, unmoved. He gave no orders, only waited. The system was working. This was not a duel between kings. It was a process, one that measured human life by rhythm and distance. Every volley of arrows was a calculation. Every French corpse, a sum completed. The chroniclers would later count the losses. 1,500 nobles dead, 11 princes, thousands of squires and men-at-arms. The English, fewer than 50. 1 Englishman for every 75. French killed. In medieval Europe, such ratios were unthinkable, but mathematics had no mercy for tradition. When the French realized the futility, it was already too late. They charged again, 16 times in total, each assault weaker, shorter, more desperate, each met by the same mechanical storm of arrows. The field became a grinder, chewing through armor, bone, and pride. Even the banners, once bright with saints and family crests, were buried under the weight of corpses. By nightfall, the archers stopped firing, not from mercy, but from exhaustion. The last arrows were pulled from the dead and reused. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of men who would not live to see dawn. The English line remained still, their discipline intact. No one cheered. Victory had no sound, only efficiency. In that silence, the medieval world ended. For 500 years, courage had been the measure of a man. At Crécy, courage was irrelevant. Calculation had won. The age of knights had been defeated by the arithmetic of death. By dusk, the battlefield of Crécy had turned into a single living wound. Rainwater mixed with blood, forming rivulets that ran downhill, carrying fragments of torn cloth, broken arrows, and human teeth. The air was thick, not with shouts anymore, but with the low, endless groaning of men crushed inside their own armor. The first French charge had died in minutes. The second never even reached the English line, yet still more came. 16 waves in total, each smaller, slower, and more desperate than the last. By the third, knights were no longer charging for glory. They were charging to die where someone might see them. The terrain itself had become the enemy. Edward's engineers had carved traps into the hillside, ditches, hidden stakes, and pits disguised by rainwater. Horses plunged headfirst, snapping their legs. Riders tumbled over them, crushed beneath the weight of armor and flesh. Each fall was another chain reaction. One man down meant 5 behind, collapsing over him. The French front turned into a writhing mass of iron. Impossible to move, impossible to breathe. The English archers watched, impassive, shooting until the sky ran out of arrows. When the quivers were empty, they ran down the slope, pulling shafts from corpses and firing them again. Men were killed by arrows that had already pierced other men. Death was recycled. In the mud, every rank, every lineage became equal. Counts and peasants lay side by side, faces indistinguishable under helmets packed with blood and dirt. Some knights tried to lift their visors to gasp for air, only to be struck through the opening by another arrow. Armor, once salvation, became execution. The longbows had done their work. Now came the melee, quiet, methodical, obscene. Archers dropped their bows and picked up mallets, daggers, and hammers. They walked among the fallen, finishing what distance had begun. Those who moved were stabbed through the joints. Those who screamed were silenced with wooden clubs. It was not rage, it was procedure. The final audit of war. A chronicler wrote that the mud swallowed the nobility of France. It wasn't metaphor. The soaked earth pulled men down by their weight, their wealth, their vanity. A knight who fell could not rise without help, and help never came. Servants and squires were long dead or fled. The more one struggled, the deeper he sank. Armor becoming both shroud and anchor. In the fading light, the slope glittered faintly with polished metal. But the shimmer wasn't splendor, it was reflection. The dying knights looked up at the sky and saw themselves mirrored in their own armor, pale and expressionless. Some prayed, some called for ransom, invoking the ancient code of capture. I yield. But there was no ransom today. The peasants of England had no interest in chivalric contracts. They killed everything that moved. Far below, the wounded horses screamed without end. Each neigh was a human sound, shrill, panicked, pleading. The archers slit their throats to silence the noise, but the valley was already alive with it, the sound of meat dying in armor. By midnight, the rain had stopped. The mist clung low to the ground, moving like breath. The battlefield no longer looked like war. It looked like a butcher's yard. Thousands of corpses, layered 3 deep, were half sunk in the mud, limbs twisted, faces buried. Every few yards, a noble banner jutted from the ground like a gravestone. The red oriflamme of France, the sacred banner said to guarantee victory, lay trampled and torn in the filth. The English lines stayed where they were, silent, lit by the dim glow of torches. Some archers slept, sitting up, boars across their laps. Others cleaned the blood from their arrows, wiping it on grass already black with it. Edward III forbade pursuit. He knew victory was already absolute. He simply ordered his men to wait for dawn, to count. When the first light came, the valley revealed its truth. Armor glinted gold under the morning sun, scattered across the mud like treasure after a shipwreck. The flower of France, dukes, princes, and lords, had been ground into a field so mutilated that bodies were indistinguishable from horses. One chronicler claimed that the crows grew so heavy they could not take flight. For days afterward, the air was black with their wings. The Battle of Crécy was not decided by bravery, nor by faith. It was decided by mud, muscle, and mathematics. The first modern victory in a medieval world. 1,000 years of hierarchy drowned in a single rainstorm. And somewhere in that quiet, a peasant, nameless, ordinary, stood on the body of a duke and drew breath. The feudal order had finally met something it couldn't trample, the ground itself. When night fell on August 26, 1346, the valley of Crécy no longer looked like France. It looked like judgment. The field was unrecognizable. A swamp of crushed armor, dying horses, and mutilated banners sinking into mud. And somewhere behind the wreckage, an old king, blind, proud, and already half in legend, asked his men for his sword. John of Bohemia, age 50, had not seen light in 10 years. But he had come to Crécy to prove that blindness was no excuse for dishonor. He commanded a small retinue of knights, each sworn to guide him into battle. When news reached him that the French lines were collapsing, that nobles were drowning in their own arrogance, he gave his final order. "Lead me to the fight. Tie my horse's reins to yours. I will strike one blow before I die." His squires begged him to stay back. Philip VI's command was in ruins. The enemy was untouchable. But John refused. He had not crossed half of Europe to live while others died. For him, death in battle was not defeat. It was the last act of sight. They tied their horses together, 5 knights, reins, knotted in a single line. Then, in the darkness, the blind king of Bohemia spurred his mount forward. He could hear the clash of steel, the screams, the rain still dripping off plate and mail. He rode straight toward the noise. Witnesses said it looked unreal. A single thread of shining armor cutting through the blackness. 5 men bound together, riding into a storm of arrows. The English archers saw them coming, but no one moved. For a moment, even the killing machine hesitated. Then came the impact. The Bohemian line crashed into the English flank, a blind fury, swinging at shadows. John's sword found air, then iron, then flesh. He struck once. He struck again. And then the line of horses went down together, tangled and pierced, collapsing as one body. When they found him at dawn, the reins were still tied. The blind king lay among his knights, eyes open, sword in hand. He had kept his promise. He had struck before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, only 16 years old, came to see the body. Moved by the courage of a man who could not see the world but still faced it, he took John's emblem, 3 ostrich feathers, and the motto, Ich dien, I serve. It remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. But courage did not redeem Crécy. It only framed its horror. Because while John died with purpose, the rest of France died without understanding. Hundreds of nobles still believed they could turn the tide. Each saw the other's deaths as failure, not warning. They charged again, 16 times before night ended, into the same slaughter. Even Philip VI, the French king himself, led a final assault near midnight. An arrow tore through his jaw. His horse collapsed beneath him. His guards had to drag him from the field, screaming to return. Behind him, the sacred banner of France, the oriflamme, fell into the mud, trampled and unclaimed. The symbol of divine protection, abandoned by divine order. By dawn, the valley had no sound left. The archers stood among corpses, pulling arrows from bodies and stringing them again, more from instinct than necessity. The French army, what was left of it, was silent, except for groaning. Even the crows were quiet, too heavy to fly. The chroniclers later tried to find meaning in the blind king's charge, an image of noble valor surviving in a world that no longer cared for it. But the truth was colder. John's death was not a final act of honor. It was the last illusion of it. He had ridden blind into a war that had already changed its nature. A war where law, not lineage, decided who lived. Where procedure replaced passion. Where kings could no longer see and peasants no longer obeyed. In that sense, John of Bohemia was the perfect symbol for France itself, noble, proud, blind, and doomed. He could not see the arrows coming. Neither could they. When the English buried their dead, only 40 men, they left the field to the crows. The French buried theirs by the thousands. Among them lay the blind king, still bound to his men, still facing the enemy. And though his courage would be remembered, it was the silence after his death that defined Crécy, a silence heavy enough to end 500 years of chivalry. By the time the blind king fell, the field of Crécy was no longer a battle. It was a grinder. The sun had set behind black clouds, but the killing did not stop. Wave after wave of French cavalry still hurled itself at the English line, as if repetition could reverse mathematics. 16 charges in total, each smaller, each slower. each more pointless than the last. They came in the dark now, guided by torchlight and madness. What had begun as the pride of Europe had become a ritual of self-destruction. The first waves had been knights. Now came squires, servants, even boys who had followed their lords into glory and found only the stench of it. Armor clanged in the mud, horses screamed, commands dissolved into noise. No one knew who led or who followed. The field itself led them, downhill, into the same trap again and again. The English no longer needed orders. They simply reloaded, aimed, and loosed. Their arrows no longer needed to find targets. Targets came to them. One chronicler wrote that the French came on like waves, and the English like the tide. Each time, the tide went out, leaving nothing behind but wreckage. By the 10th charge, the ground was so clogged with corpses that horses could not gallop. Knights stumbled over the dead, slipped on blood, and sank knee-deep into the soil. Some fought on foot, swinging swords that could barely lift in the mud. Others fell to their knees and were trampled by the next rank. There was no front line anymore, only collision, collapse, and sound. Even the English began to move differently. They were no longer fighting men, they were maintaining a process. Archers shot until their fingers bled. When their arrows ran out, they dragged the wounded French closer and used their knives. A knight's worth was measured not by name or coat of arms, but by how many seconds he delayed the next volley. The Black Prince, Edward's 16-year-old son, stood in the center line, knee-deep in corpses. Chroniclers say he fought quietly, without rage, as if he already understood that this was not glory. It was arithmetic. His armor was caked with blood, not his own. When word reached Edward III that his son was under pressure, the king refused to send reinforcements. "Let the boy win his spurs," he said. In that moment, even fatherly pride became part of the system. Discipline before emotion, order before mercy. Across the valley, Philip VI had lost everything but delusion. Twice wounded, his face bleeding from an arrow that tore through his jaw, he still tried to rally his nobles. He shouted for one last charge, for the honor of France, for the Oriflamme. But the sacred banner that had promised divine victory lay trampled somewhere in the mud, invisible under the weight of the dead. Few heard his voice. Those who did could no longer move. Their horses were gone, their banners shredded, their families scattered across the field. Honor had no audience left. By midnight, the noise faded. The final charges broke like waves on rock, brief, furious, and forgotten. Knights crawled through corpses, begging to be taken prisoner. But the English had no ransoms to collect. This was not a war for profit or prestige. It was a system clearing its ledger. Archers with mallets moved through the field, checking bodies. A helmet that stirred was crushed. A groan ended with a blow. It wasn't hatred. It was policy. The field, once shining with heraldry, had become uniform. Everything the same color. Mud, blood, and rust. No one could tell which corpses were kings and which were criminals. The hierarchy had melted into the earth. At dawn, Philip's surviving guards dragged him from the field. He fought them, trying to return, shouting through the hole in his jaw that France was not beaten. But France was gone. Her sons lay faceless beneath the fog, her nobles indistinguishable from the peasants they once ruled. Chroniclers called it the end of courage. They were wrong. Courage had not ended. It had been devoured. Each charge had been a ritual feeding the grinder, a ceremony of pride so absolute it refused to stop until nothing remained to perform it. When morning came, the English line stood exactly where it had begun. The slope below them looked like the surface of another planet, black, uneven, glistening in the dew. Crows circled low, too heavy to fly for long. The French king's banner had vanished. Only silence remained. That night, an age ended without ceremony. No trumpets, no treaties. Only the sound of flies gathering on the corpses of men who had mistaken lineage for law. Crécy was not a defeat. It was an erasure. The noble class had marched itself into extinction, 16 times in a row. Dawn came slowly over Crécy. The mist rose first, thin, grey, and almost beautiful, until the light revealed what it hid. The valley below was a single, endless grave. Bodies layered 3 deep, horses still twitching, armour glinting like frost. The English barely moved. They stood where they had fought, silent, staring down at what they had done. They had not won a victory. They had performed an equation, and the result was perfection. In one afternoon, 1,500 French nobles lay dead. 11 princes, a duke, counts beyond number, and thousands of knights. The English dead, 40. Not 400. 40. For every Englishman who fell, 37 French nobles had died. It was not courage that produced that ratio. It was structure. A weapon worth 10 shillings had erased armour worth 1,000 pounds. Peasants trained by law had annihilated men raised for war. The chroniclers of the time called it divine intervention. But there was nothing divine about it. It was bureaucracy, precision, and patience, the cold arithmetic of power. For centuries, Europe had believed that war was moral order made visible, that noble blood conferred divine right, and divine right decided victory. But Crécy destroyed that illusion. It proved that faith could not resist form, that obedience, multiplied by repetition, was more lethal than valor multiplied by pride. Every system has its language. At Crécy, that language was geometry. The V formation of English archers had turned a hill into a machine. Every volley overlapped with the next, every shaft of yew following the rhythm of law. 5,000 archers, each releasing 12 arrows per minute, 60,000 arrows every 60 seconds. In 4 hours, more than 14 million projectiles had fallen on the richest men in Europe. The field was no longer a battlefield. It was a ledger. Every shaft a line of entry, every corpse a closing balance. When the killing stopped, only numbers remained, and those numbers rewrote history. For the first time in Europe, law had outperformed lineage. England's longbowmen were not warriors by heritage. They were products of regulation. They existed because of statute, not blood. The state had created them the way it created taxes, through compulsion and repetition. Every Sunday after church, men stood on the green, drew the bow, and obeyed. That obedience, mocked for decades as trivial, had just destroyed half the French aristocracy. The idea spread faster than the crows could feed. Commanders across Europe realized that power no longer lived in birth, but in system, in logistics, in measurable efficiency. From that day on, war was not an art of bravery. It was an administration of death. Even the church, that eternal arbiter of hierarchy, struggled to comprehend the loss. If God chose kings, why had he favored peasants? If chivalry was divine, why had it drowned in mud? The chroniclers twisted themselves into scripture, calling it a test of faith, a trial of humility. But everyone who saw the field knew the truth. God had been replaced by calculation. Philip VI, wounded and humiliated, fled the battlefield before sunrise. He would later try to rebuild his army, but the damage went deeper than numbers. Entire provinces were leaderless, their lords gone in one afternoon. Feudal bonds collapsed, tax rolls went blank. Letters of inheritance had no names left to write. The survivors called it the death of nobility, but it was something colder. It was the birth of the state. From this mud-soaked hill in northern France, the future of power emerged, a world where obedience was weaponized and efficiency became faith. The French, for all their pride, would copy the very system that destroyed them. They would train their own archers, recruit mercenaries, and enforce drills. The chivalric ideal, the belief that courage made a man noble, had been reduced to an equation. Discipline, X, law, is victory. Edward III understood what he had built. His army was not the largest, nor the most glorious, but it was reproducible, a design, not a dynasty, and that made it unstoppable. When the English left Crécy, they did not sing. They marched in silence, leaving behind the field that had buried 5 centuries of tradition. Behind them, peasants began stripping the dead, pulling rings from fingers, cutting silk from armor, melting plate for scrap. The poor were now feeding on the powerful, literally and economically. It was not looting, it was redistribution. In time, this new arithmetic would grow sharper. Gunpowder would soon replace the bow, and the bureaucracy that trained archers would train gunners instead. Killing would become quicker, cheaper, more efficient, less human. Crécy was only the beginning, the moment when courage ceased to decide and compliance began to rule. When the weapon of the future was no longer the sword, but the system. Because on August 26, 1346, one truth was carved into the mud of France, the first truth of modern power. Obedience outlasts glory. When dawn burned through the mist, Crécy looked less like a battlefield and more like an autopsy table for civilization. The valley reeked of iron, sweat, and rot. The French nobility, once Europe's most radiant image of power, now lay stripped, pale, and faceless in the mud. The peasants arrived first. They came from the nearby villages of Crécy, Estrée, and Wadicourt, farmers, tanners, shepherds, drawn by the smell of death and the promise of wealth. They did not come to mourn, they came to harvest. Armour worth £1,000, once fitted only for dukes, was hacked apart with knives and hammers. Gold rings were pried from fingers, necklaces were ripped from throats. The same peasants who once bowed when knights rode past now bent those bodies backward to cut the straps that held their plate. The social order had been inverted, not by revolution, but by gravity. The rich lay lower than the poor, and the poor now fed on their remains. Crows blanketed the field so thick that travellers from Calais said the sky itself had turned black. They gorged themselves until they could not fly, waddling from corpse to corpse, too heavy to take wing. One monk wrote that God had darkened the air to hide his shame. The English did not stay to watch. They moved on toward Calais, leaving behind tens of thousands of French dead and an idea buried with them. That nobility guaranteed meaning. Behind them, the countryside broke open. Wolves came down from the woods. Dogs from nearby villages turned feral, gnawing at the bones of their former masters. For days, no one dared to bury the bodies. The ground was too soft, the air too thick, and the number too great. The dead rotted in armor, bloating until the metal plates split open from within. In the August heat, the smell carried for miles. Travelers fainted on the roads, priests fainted at the sight. But eventually, the living came to collect. Merchants from Flanders, scavengers from Picardy, even English camp followers returned under white flags. They sorted the fallen like goods at market. Jewels here, weapons there, helmets melted down for coin, silk cloaks sold as bedding. Every piece of France's aristocracy was monetized. Their glory had become currency. A chronicler wrote that peasants grew rich, as if the Lord himself had redistributed the world. But it wasn't divine justice. It was decomposition, moral and physical. The same laws that once protected the noble class had no meaning here. A corpse could not demand deference. A count's face looked no different from a stable hand's after 3 days in the sun. And so the peasants learned a new truth. Death was the great equalizer not by theology, but by texture. Under enough mud, all flesh looks the same. Months later, when French heralds came to recover the bodies of the highborn, they could not identify them. Coats of arms were shredded, armor stripped, crests stolen. Entire lineages vanished into anonymity, erased by scavengers and time. The Duke of Lorraine was found only because his jaw still clutched a gold crucifix. Others were never found at all. The French chroniclers called Crécy a humiliation. But to the people who survived it, it was liberation. The peasants who scavenged that field would tell their children that for once, a farmer's hands had profited from noble flesh. They would show them coins minted from melted armor, rings cut from princely fingers, fabric sewn from looted banners. And those children would remember that the earth itself had chosen sides. For decades afterward, farmers ploughing near Crécy unearthed bones and rusted mail. Each time, the relics were sold to merchants, relics of an age when courage still believed it ruled. But by then, courage had been redefined, not as sacrifice, but as endurance, not as faith, but as survival. The French monarchy would never recover its old certainty. Too many nobles had vanished, too many families extinguished. The administrative network collapsed, titles went unclaimed, estates fell into ruin. In one day, the idea of noble continuity, that power passed through blood, had been torn from the soil like a weed. And all of it began with a single law in England, that every man, rich or poor, must train with the bow. The French dead had mocked that law. Now they were buried by it. By the year's end, plague would sweep through Europe. The Black Death would kill far more than Crécy ever did, but it would not shock the world in the same way. Plague was nature's will. Crécy was man's choice. Order turned against its creators. And when the fields were finally cleared, when only the bones remained, the people of Picardy named the valley Le Champ des Draps d'Or, the field of the cloth of gold, for the way the nobles' robes had once shimmered before sinking into the mud. A fitting name, because the field did not just swallow men, it swallowed meaning. In the mud of Crécy, luxury was indistinguishable from filth. And for the first time in history, the rich died exactly like the poor. Crécy did not just kill men, it taught empires how to count. For the first time in European history, a king did not measure victory by glory, banners, or songs, but by ratios. Edward III's clerks recorded everything: the number of arrows loosed, the number of men fed, the number of nobles dead. War had become a ledger, and the entries balanced perfectly. 40 English dead, 1,500 French nobles, thousands more soldiers and squires. The figures were absurd, so absurd that chroniclers refused to believe them. But Edward's scribes had no reason to lie. For them, numbers were not miracles. They were evidence. Evidence that discipline could outperform destiny. Every arrow loosed at Crécy had been purchased, catalogued, and transported through a system that England had been perfecting for decades. Quartermasters issued them by count. Sheriffs enforced the laws that trained the men to shoot them. Parliament taxed the wool trade to fund the campaign. It was not heroism, it was administration. France had gone to war with faith and pageantry. England had gone with paperwork. That difference changed everything. For 5 centuries, kings had relied on charisma, on divine sanction, noble birth, and personal courage. But after Crécy, those qualities looked primitive. You could not replicate bravery. You could replicate process. The English army was not a miracle of courage. It was a machine of logistics. 5,000 longbowmen, each performing the same movement 12 times per minute, created a rhythm of industrial precision centuries before factories existed. Every archer was a gear, every arrow a unit of output, every volley a calculation. Historians would later call Crécy the birth of modern warfare, but that misses its deeper truth. It was the birth of modern thinking, the moment the human cost of war became measurable, predictable, and therefore acceptable. Once death could be counted, it could be optimized. The church recoiled at the idea. How could something so mechanical still serve God's will? But the men who ruled learned quickly that counting was power. Numbers could justify anything. If 40 Englishmen could destroy 1,500 nobles, then perhaps divine favor had nothing to do with blood, only with efficiency. Within a generation, royal accountants replaced priests as the new interpreters of victory. Ledgers mattered more than blessings. Bureaucrats replaced heroes. The empire had learned its first mathematical lesson: victory favors organization. Even the way war was remembered began to change. In the songs of old, men had died for something: honor, faith, beauty. After Crécy, men died as part of something: a formation, a calculation, a plan. The romantic language of sacrifice gave way to the cold language of yield and loss. Where poets once wrote of valor, clerks now wrote of output. And with that shift came a darker consequence. When you can count the dead, you can accept them. You can predict them. You can decide how many you're willing to lose. Crécy became a model, not for chivalry, but for systematized killing. Other rulers copied it. The French rebuilt their armies using English methods, standardized commands, drilled formations, regulated supply. The Holy Roman Empire followed. Warfare became mathematics wearing armor. Even the longbow itself was soon replaced, not because it failed, but because it required too much training. It took a lifetime to create a longbowman. It took one day to teach a man to fire a gun. Gunpowder was bureaucracy's natural evolution, a weapon that could be standardized, stored, distributed, and used by anyone. The state no longer needed skilled killers. It only needed obedient ones. That was the hidden legacy of Crécy. Not victory, but replacement. The replacement of courage with calculation, of hierarchy with system, of the man with the mechanism. In this new order, killing was no longer personal. It was procedural. A king could order death without ever seeing the faces of the dying. A soldier could obey without ever knowing who he killed, and both could sleep, because numbers did not haunt the way faces did. Crécy's lessons spread through every generation that followed. At Poitiers, the same system worked again. At Agincourt, it worked better. The same geometry, the same logic, the same efficiency. Each battle confirmed that chivalry was obsolete, that the pen and the tally sheet would rule the sword. The Middle Ages had begun in faith. It ended in mathematics. And from that moment on, every empire learned the same rule. You do not need to believe in victory, only to calculate it. By the time gunpowder conquered the longbow, the process was complete. War no longer needed heroes. It only needed clerks. Men who could turn blood into numbers, and numbers into policy. Crécy's hill remained silent, but its influence spoke louder than any sermon. It whispered a single principle that would define every empire to come, from the trenches of Europe to the bureaucracies of the modern state. Killing, once sacred, was now statistical. By the time the crows finished, the world that had sent those knights to war was gone. The banners that once defined kingdoms now hung in tatters, fading into the same mud that had devoured their owners. Crécy did not end a battle, it ended a belief. For 500 years, Europe had lived by a single equation: courage equals virtue, and virtue equals right to rule. That faith had filled cathedrals, crowned kings, and justified conquest. But on August 26th, 1346, courage lost its currency, because courage without system dies. And at Crécy, obedience outlasted it. The knights of France had believed that war was theatre, a test of honor before God. They rode in polished armor, carrying relics, banners, and pride. But what they faced on that hillside was not an army of men, it was a process, one built from repetition, law, and discipline. And no relic can bless a machine. The longbowmen of England were not heroes, they were instruments. Their power came not from faith, but from habit. They obeyed a statute, not a spirit. And that obedience, cold, bureaucratic, perfect, made them the most efficient killers of their age. That was the true horror of Crécy. Not the blood, not the arrows, but the logic. The discovery that morality could be replaced by mathematics, that valor could be rendered obsolete by velocity. The French knights had charged 16 times. They had prayed, screamed, and died. And in every charge, the result was identical. Courage had become repetition, bravery, a calculation. The age of meaning was over. In the centuries that followed, kings and generals would refine the lesson. They would turn that muddy hill into a template of firepower, formation, and control. From Crécy to Agincourt, from gunpowder to machine guns, the same principle endured. The power that wins is the one that counts, not the one that believes. The irony was divine. The very discipline that had made England victorious, the law that turned peasants into soldiers, would one day erase them too. For when weapons no longer require training, obedience becomes the only skill that matters. And obedience has no loyalty, only use. Gunpowder would soon render the longbow obsolete. A weapon that any farmer could master in a day replaced one that required a lifetime of practice. The longbowmen who killed France's nobility would vanish, just as their victims had. The system that raised them no longer needed them. Thus ended not just an army, but an era, the final death of chivalry. Honor had no function, glory had no metric, and God, it seemed, had no preference. The battlefield that once defined nobility had become its grave. Crécy was the hinge between worlds, the Middle Ages closing, the modern one opening, born not from art or faith, but from calculation. From this mud came the future, the accountant's war, the engineer's empire, the mechanized conscience. Even now the field remains quiet. A small stone monument marks the spot. Few tourists stop there. Fewer still understand what they are standing on. Because it isn't just a field in northern France. It's the place where meaning died, where the sword met the statistic, where the body met the ledger, where courage met the clock and lost. Crécy was not the end of a battle. It was the beginning of us, the rational, ordered, obedient modern world, where every death has a place, a number, and a purpose, written somewhere in ink. And if you walk that field at dawn, when the mist clings low and the ground still smells of rain, you can almost hear the rhythm that replaced prayer, the creak of yew wood, the snap of bowstrings, and the sound of history exhaling as it finally learned to count. In the mud of Crécy, the Middle Ages drowned, and modern war was born, completed.